Take a moment right now, wherever you are, to let your body settle. Feel the weight of yourself pressing gently down into whatever is beneath you. The mattress, the pillow, the soft give of something that is holding you up without effort, without asking anything of you in return. Feel your shoulders drop. Feel the small muscles around your eyes let go of whatever they have been holding on to all day. Feel your jaw unclench, just a little, and then a little more. There is nothing that needs doing right now. Whatever was on your mind today, whatever it was that kept your thoughts spinning and your attention scattered and your chest a little tight, it can wait. It has waited this long, and it will wait until morning. And morning is a very long way away from this quiet moment. So breathe in. Let the breath come all the way down. Let it fill you slowly, the way a room filled with warmth when the fire has been going for a while. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and completely, until the cold is simply not there anymore. And then let the breath go. Let it drift out of you like smoke rising from a low fire on a still night, rising and thinning and dispersing into the dark. Good. Just like that. We are going somewhere tonight. Somewhere that is very far from here and very long ago. We are going to let the present century peel away from us, layer by layer, the way you might pull back the covers on a bed that has been made and remade and slept in for a very long time. We are going to let the lights of this world dim and the sounds of it quiet and the familiar textures of it recede. We are going back, a long way back. Back past the last century and the one before it, back past the age of industry and the age of print, back through the narrowing corridors of recorded time, to a period that is at once utterly foreign and deeply, essentially human. We are going to medieval England, to the 14th century, to a particular autumn, to a particular field at the edge of a particular valley where a stone castle sits on a low hill, and around it, spread out across the brown grass and the cold mud and the grey morning mist, is an army. Not an army preparing to fight, not an army on the march or charging across a field or doing any of the dramatic, loud, violent things that armies in stories usually do. This is an army doing something that armies almost never get credit for, something that took as much endurance and skill and quiet courage as any battle. This army is waiting. This army is sitting still. This army is, in the hours we are going to spend together, trying to sleep. And that is our story tonight. Not the siege engines, not the commanders in their pavilions making bold decisions, not the clash of iron and the crack of breaking stone. Those things are there, somewhere in the background of this story, but they are not what we are here for tonight. We are here for the ordinary soldier. The man rolled in his cloak at 3 a.m, his breath making small white clouds in the freezing air. The castle walls a dark presence at the edge of his vision, the ground beneath him hard and cold and smelling of frost and turned earth, and the hundreds of other men sleeping close around him. We are here for the small, slow, deeply human experience of trying to rest in an uncomfortable and uncertain place. Let your breathing slow a little further. Let the image begin to form around you, softly, the way a landscape becomes visible as your eyes adjust to the dark. Here we go, back, slowly, all the way back. Imagine you are standing at the edge of the camp just before dawn. The sky above you is the colour of dark iron. Not black, not yet, but the deep, cold grey of the hour that comes before even the first suggestion of light. the hour that belongs entirely to the night, even as the night is preparing to leave. The stars are out, the same stars that have always been out, the ones that do not care which century it is or what is happening on the ground below them. They are thick and cold and very bright, because there are no lights here to compete with them, not anywhere. The darkness is the real darkness of before electricity, the darkness that most people alive today have never truly experienced, honest, complete, all the way down to the ground. You can see the castle from here. It is perhaps 300 yards away, which feels both very far and not nearly far enough, and it sits on its low hill like something that has always been there and intends to remain there indefinitely, which is in fact exactly the attitude it is projecting. The walls are thick and pale in the starlight. The towers rise at its corners, solid and patient. On the battlements you can see, if you look carefully, the very faint glow of a torch or a fire, just a smear of orange light against the stone, just enough to tell you that someone up there is awake and watching. The garrison knows you are here. Of course they do. They have known for months. Between you and those walls is a wide expanse of ground that has been thoroughly ruined over the course of this siege. The grass that was here in the summer has been trampled to mud. The mud has been churned by thousands of feet and dozens of cartwheels, and the hooves of horses into something that is more geological than agricultural. Deep, cold, pocked with puddles that have a thin skin of ice on them this morning, threaded with the ruts of wagon wheels that have hardened in the overnight cold into sharp ridges that catch your feet if you're not watching, and spread across this ground, from the edge of the cleared zone before the castle's walls all the way back to the tree line behind you, is the camp. The camp is enormous. This is one of the things that surprises people when they first think seriously about a medieval siege, the scale of it. An army of 4,000 or 5,000 men, which is not a very large medieval army, needs a great deal of space, not just for the men themselves, but for their horses, their equipment, their food stores, their fires, their latrines, the wagons that have been bringing supplies up the road from the south for the past 3 months. The camp is not a neat thing. It has grown organically the way settlements grow, following the logic of convenience rather than any plan. Tents clustered near the water source, horses kept downwind of the sleeping areas, the great siege engines standing like sleeping giants at the edge of arrow range, draped in wet hides to protect them from fire arrows. From where you stand at the edge of it in the pre-dawn dark, it looks like a small city that has been set down in a field and forgotten. A city that is, at this hour, almost entirely asleep. Almost, because the camp is never entirely asleep. His name is Robert. We will call him Robert because it was a name as common as mud in 14th century England, a name that you would hear called out in any village or camp or marketplace and have 3 men turn around at once. Robert of Derbyshire, the men sometimes call him to distinguish him from the other Roberts in the company, or sometimes simply Rob, or sometimes Derby, which is close enough. Robert is 22 years old, which in the 14th century means he is not young in the way we might think of 22 as young. He has been working since he was 7 years old and soldiering since he was 17, and he has the body of a man who has been doing hard physical work outdoors in all weathers for his entire conscious life. He is not tall, The average height of Englishmen in this period is around 5 feet 6, and Robert is perhaps an inch below that. But he is broad through the chest and shoulders, and his hands are large and rough, the hands of a man who handles heavy things with little rest. He has been at this siege for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of the same castle, the same walls, the same view, the same cold ground, and the same routine of watch and sleep and watch again. He has, in those 11 weeks, fought in exactly one significant engagement, a skirmish at the castle's eastern gate when the garrison attempted a night sortie and were driven back, and has spent the remaining time doing the patient, unglamorous work of siege, cutting wood, digging, carrying, standing guard, maintaining equipment, and waiting. He is currently standing the second night watch, which runs from roughly midnight to what the camp sergeants calculate to be about 2 in the morning, though the calculation is approximate and always has been. The watch is divided not by clockwork, but by the sergeant's judgment and the position of the stars and a large sand glass that sits in the watch captain's tent, and is turned by a boy who has the important and exhausting job of watching the sand run through and turning the glass again without falling asleep, which he does with varying degrees of success. Robert is standing at his post, which is a section of the camp's outer perimeter, roughly 40 yards from the nearest siege engine. The perimeter is marked by a low palisade, a line of sharpened stakes driven into the ground, which would not stop a determined force but would slow one down and make noise and trip people in the dark, which is its actual purpose. Beyond the palisade, the ground has been kept clear for 20 yards in either direction, a cleared zone that ensures that anyone approaching the camp can be seen before they are on top of it. He is standing still, which requires more effort than it sounds when it is this cold and this dark and this quiet, and you have been awake since midnight. His breath comes out in slow, white clouds. He watches them form and dissolve and form again, and he watches the cleared ground beyond the palisade, and he watches the castle, and he thinks about being warm. The cold at this hour, in the middle of an October night in the English Midlands, is a serious cold. Not the dramatic killing cold of a true northern winter, not yet. That is still a month away, and the commanders are hoping the castle will have fallen before it arrives, because a siege in hard winter is a misery that tests everyone on both sides of the walls. But it is the cold of deep autumn, of ground that is nearly frozen, of air that has no warmth left in it from the previous day and will have none until the sun is well up in the morning. It is the kind of cold that settles into your joints and finds all the places where you are thin or poorly covered, and makes itself known there specifically and precisely. Robert is wearing a great deal. This is the thing about medieval soldiers that surprises people who are used to thinking of them as leather and chainmail figures in paintings. They wore a great deal of clothing because they had to, because the alternative was freezing. Under his mail shirt he has a padded linen undershirt. Over the mail he has a thick woolen surcoat, a loose long garment that covers him from throat to mid-thigh, dyed a faded reddish-brown that was once brighter when it was new. Over the surcoat on watch nights he pulls his cloak, a heavy, dense wool cloak, dark in colour, long enough to reach his calves, with a hood that he pulls up over his helmet on cold nights so that only his face is exposed to the air. The cloak is the single most important thing Robert owns. It is worth more than the sword at his hip, more than his mail, more than the boots on his feet. It is his blanket when he sleeps, his shelter from rain when there is no tent, his warmth when everything else has failed. He has had this particular cloak for 4 years. He has slept in it, marched in it, stood watch in it in 3 different campaigns. It smells of him, of wood smoke, of horse, of the damp that gets into wool when it rains and never quite fully leaves. It is, in its way, more his home than any place has been since he left Derbyshire. He shifts his weight from foot to foot, not from nervousness but from necessity. Standing completely still for long periods in the cold causes the feet to lose sensation, and he has learned to keep small movements going to keep the blood circulating. The movement makes a faint sound, the creak of leather, the very soft clink of his mail. Around him the camp breathes. That is the only word for the sound a large sleeping camp makes. It breathes. It makes the low, continuous sound of many hundreds of sleeping people, a sound that is more felt than heard, a presence in the air rather than a distinct noise. There is the irregular rhythm of snoring from the nearest tents. There is the occasional muffled movement of a man turning over. There is the sound of horses shifting in their lines, the soft percussion of a hoof against the cold ground, the slow tearing of a horse cropping the last of the grass between the tent ropes. There is, from somewhere across the camp, the low voice of another watchman talking quietly to his companion. Too far away to make out words, just the murmur of 2 people filling a quiet night with sound, because the quiet has a quality to it that is easier to manage if you are making some noise yourself. And behind all of it, always the castle. It does not make much sound at this hour. Now and then a sound carries over the walls, a voice, a footstep on stone. Once in a great while the sound of something being moved or struck. The garrison is awake. Up there, or enough of them are awake, standing their own watches behind their own walls, looking out at the camp with the same careful attention that Robert is directing at them. In this, the besiegers and the besieged are mirror images of each other, performing the same patient, exhausting, repetitive act of watchfulness in opposite directions. Robert thinks about this sometimes, in the long quiet hours of the second watch, about the man standing on the other side of those walls who is doing exactly what he is doing. Cold, tired, watching, waiting. He wonders occasionally if that man thinks about him. The tent that Robert sleeps in, when he is not on watch, when he has the hours given to sleep, is shared with 7 other men from his company. 8 men in a tent that is roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, which sounds impossibly cramped until you consider that in the coldest nights the closeness of the bodies is the primary source of warmth, and that medieval soldiers are not people who require much personal space, because personal space has never been a concept available to them. The tent is a simple structure, 2 upright poles at either end supporting a ridge pole over which a length of heavy waxed canvas is draped and pegged to the ground at the sides with wooden stakes. The floor is the ground, covered with a layer of bracken and straw that has been refreshed twice since the siege began and has, despite this, the smell of a place where 8 men have been sleeping for 11 weeks. It is a warm smell, at least, alive and human and real. Inside the tent at this hour, 7 men are asleep. They sleep in a particular arrangement that has been established through negotiation and habit over the weeks. The two men on either side sleep against the canvas walls, which means they are slightly colder but have something solid to put their backs against. The remaining men sleep in the centre, alternating heads and feet to pack the maximum number of bodies into the available space, like the teeth of two combs fitted together. Everyone sleeps in their clothes. Everyone sleeps in their cloaks. Most of them sleep with something metal somewhere close. A knife, a sword, a hatchet. Not because they are expecting immediate danger, but because the habit of having a weapon within arm's reach is so deeply ingrained that sleeping without one feels wrong, feels unfinished, feels the way forgetting to close a door feels in the moment before sleep, when you suddenly cannot remember if you closed it or not. The sounds inside the tent are the sounds of 8 men in various stages and varieties of sleep. There is Edmund, the oldest of them at 38, who snores with a regularity and volume that his tent mates have learned to accept the way they accept rain, unpleasant, unavoidable, and ultimately ignorable once you have been exposed to it long enough. There is young Thomas, 17 years old and on his first campaign, who makes no sound at all when he sleeps but moves constantly, turning and adjusting and occasionally throwing an arm out in a way that invariably ends up on whoever is sleeping next to him. There is Will Carpenter, who got his name from his father's trade, and who can fall asleep in less time than it takes to blow out a candle, and who stays asleep through things that wake everyone else, through Edmund's snoring, through Thomas's arm, through the sound of rain on the canvas, through almost everything except the sound of the watch captain calling the next watch. And there is the space where Robert would be sleeping if he were not on watch. A slight compression in the straw and bracken. A warmth in the wool of the cloak that has been rolled up and left there, that will be waiting for him when his watch ends and he comes back in and lies down and pulls the cloak over him and feels the tent's warmth close around him like something remembered. Let your body feel heavier now, and let the weight of it sink down slowly, the way a stone settles into soft ground, finding its depth. There are other watchmen along the perimeter. Robert cannot see most of them from where he stands. The curve of the camp's edge and the dark between the fires means his direct sightline covers only a short stretch of palisade in either direction. But he knows they are there. He knows Hugh Barker is 40 yards to his left, a thick-set man from the Midlands who holds his watch with the stoic, uncomplaining patience of an ox, who never speaks much on duty, but whose mere physical presence is reassuring in the way that large, calm things are reassuring. He knows that to his right, perhaps 60 yards away, 2 men share a post together, which is the custom for the sections of the perimeter that face the castle most directly. The sections where a sortie would most likely come, where a single man alone in the dark is considered insufficient. The partnership system for the most exposed watches was a practical necessity, not a concession to comfort. A single man standing alone in the cold and the dark for 2 hours is a man whose attention wanders, whose eyelids become heavy, whose mind begins to drift toward the particular grey warmth that precedes sleep, not out of dereliction, but out of simple biology, the biology of a body that has been working all day and is now standing still in cold air, at an hour when everything in it is telling it to lie down. Two men together kept each other awake. They talked in low voices. They noticed each other's silences and gave a nudge when a silence had gone on too long. The system was not perfect, but it was better than the alternative. Robert had served enough watches alone and enough with a partner to know the difference. Alone, the watch was a private endurance, a slow battle with his own fatigue in which he deployed every small strategy he had, moving when he felt his attention softening, counting stones in the palisade, reciting in his head the names of everyone he knew from home, studying the castle walls with the careful specificity of a man who is trying to notice something new. With a partner, the time passed differently. Not necessarily faster, but less like a test. Tonight he was alone. His partner from the previous watch had reported sick before the rotation, and the watch captain, short of men, had posted Robert solo for this section. It was not unusual, it was simply how it was. He moved his feet again, step left, step right. The small familiar dance of staying warm. Above him, very faint now, a cloud was moving across the face of the stars, a slow dark mass drifting from the west. Not a storm cloud, he thought. The edges of it were too soft, too ragged for rain. Just the ordinary cloud of an October night. The sky doing what the sky did, indifferent to the army below it and the castle it was encircling and the purposes of both. He watched the cloud pass across a bright star, and then the star reappeared, undimmed, exactly as it had been. He breathed out slowly. The night continued. The watch ends. It ends not with a bell or a clock, but with the sound of the watch captain making his round, the man's familiar footsteps on the frozen ground, the low word of greeting exchanged with each watchman as he passes, the confirmation that the post has been held, the quiet word that releases the man from his vigil. Robert is released at what is approximately 2 a.m. He stands for a moment after the captain has passed, looking at the castle one more time. The torch on their battlements is still there, still burning, still watching. He turns and walks back toward the tent. The camp at 2 a.m. has a quality of quiet that is different from all the other qualities of quiet it has during the night. It is past the hour when people are still awake by choice. The gamblers have finished their games, the drinkers have drunk what they were going to drink. The men who were lying awake worrying have, most of them, finally surrendered to sleep. And it is before the hour when the camp begins to stir toward morning, before the cooks start the fires, before the horses start their early restlessness, before the first light begins to change the quality of the darkness. It is the deepest hour, the quietest, the one that belongs most fully to sleep. Robert moves through this quiet carefully, picking his way between the tents, stepping over the ropes that stake them to the ground. He knows this path. He has walked it every time his watch has ended for 11 weeks, and his feet know it now in the way that feet learn a path, not consciously, not with deliberate attention to landmarks, but simply through the accumulated memory of repetition. He could walk it with his eyes closed, and on the darker nights he has come close to doing exactly that. He passes the fire that burns at the centre of the company's area of the camp. The fire is low at this hour. It has been banked for the night, built up with wet wood and turf so that it burns slowly and lasts till morning rather than blazing brightly and burning out. It gives off more smoke than flame, and the smoke rises straight up in the still night air in a thick grey column that carries the smell of green wood and damp earth and the ghost of the evening's cooking. The thin mutton stew that was supper, the bread that was baked this morning in the camp's field ovens. He stops at the fire for a moment, holds his hands out toward it. The warmth is not dramatic. It is the warmth of a dying fire, modest and uneven, but after 2 hours in the cold air it feels like something close to luxury. He stands there for perhaps a minute, letting his hands warm, letting the smell of the smoke settle around him, and then he continues to the tent. He unlaces the tent flap, a simple arrangement of leather ties, stiff with the cold but manageable, and ducks inside. The warmth hits him immediately. The warmth of 7 sleeping men in a small enclosed space is a real, physical warmth, a warmth with weight to it, a warmth that smells strongly of wool and bodies and breath, and the slightly sweet smell of the straw underfoot. After the cold of the open camp, it is overwhelming in the best possible way. He does not undress. There is no undressing. He removes his helmet and sets it down carefully beside his place in the straw. He loosens the laces of his surcoat but does not remove it. He eases himself down into the space that has been waiting for him. The compression is the straw that is shaped, after 11 weeks, to something approaching the shape of him, and he pulls the cloak over him and closes his eyes. Edmund snores. Thomas shifts and throws his arm out, and it lands across Robert's shins. Robert does not move it. He has long since stopped moving it. He lies still, and the warmth of the tent gathers around him, and the sounds of the sleeping camp come in through the canvas. The horses, the distant voice of the new watch, the faint sound of wind beginning to pick up in the trees at the edge of the camp. And he lets them all be. He does not think about tomorrow. He does not think about the castle. He thinks about nothing in particular, because the particular comfort of horizontal warmth after cold vertical wakefulness is so overwhelming that thought does not really have a foothold in it. He is asleep in under 2 minutes. The sleep of a siege camp soldier on a cold October night is a particular kind of sleep. It is deep in the way that physical exhaustion makes sleep deep, the body simply taking what it needs, descending quickly and completely into the restorative darkness, without the long preamble of tossing and wakefulness that can accompany the more anxious, more comfortable nights of peacetime. There is a kind of mercy in true exhaustion, a mercy that is easy to miss when you are experiencing the exhaustion, but which the body delivers reliably and completely. When you're tired enough, you sleep. You do not lie awake running through tomorrow's worries. You do not fret and turn and kick the covers. You go down and you stay down. And whatever the night brings you in the form of dreams is the night's own business. Robert dreams sometimes of the mine. He does not know why the mine has become the dominant subject of his sleeping mind when the waking day offers so much else. The castle, the camp, the faces of the men around him, the memory of the skirmish at the eastern gate. But the mine visits him at night with a frequency that has become familiar, even ordinary, the way recurring dreams become ordinary. He is in it, in the dream, crawling in its dark and narrow space, and the air is bad and the lamp is very small and far ahead of him. There is a light that he is moving toward, and the earth around him is close and heavy and breathing in its deep geological way, and it does not threaten him, but it is present, more present than almost anything else, and its presence is the whole content of the dream. Just this earth, just this tunnel, just this movement toward the distant patient light. He wakes from these dreams easily, and lies for a moment in the tense warmth, and listens to Edmund snoring, and feels the weight of the dream release itself from him, the way a hand releases something it was holding without being aware it was holding, and he is comfortable, and he is warm, and he is on solid ground, and the dream lets him go. He sleeps again. The camp as a whole sleeps in shifts and layers, in watches and rotations, in the complex interlocking pattern that keeps an army functional through the night, while ensuring that at every moment there are enough men awake to respond to danger. Understanding this pattern is understanding one of the great underappreciated achievements of medieval military organization. The problem of keeping thousands of men safe, fed, warm enough to survive, and ready to respond through weeks and months of static, grinding, unglamorous siege, is not a simple problem, and the solutions to it were not accidental. The watch system divided the night into segments, usually 4, each lasting somewhere between 2 and 3 hours depending on the season and the length of the night. Each company of soldiers, typically a unit of between 20 and 100 men, depending on the army's organization, provided watchmen for their section of the camp's perimeter in rotation. If your company had 40 men, and the perimeter required 10 watchmen at any given time, then roughly a quarter of the company was awake at any moment, and the other 3/4 were sleeping, eating, or resting. This schedule was managed by the watch sergeant, who was among the most important practical functionaries in any medieval military camp. Not a glamorous role, not a role celebrated in chronicles or poems, but the role that determined whether the camp woke up to face a dawn raid or whether it did not. The watch sergeant kept the tally of who was on duty and when, ensured the transitions between watches happened cleanly and quietly, dealt with the men who claimed illness or injury to avoid their turn, and was responsible for the most feared of all camp announcements, the call to arms in the night. That call, a horn usually or a shouted alarm relayed from post to post around the perimeter, was the sound that every sleeping soldier in the camp kept some portion of his mind tuned to, even in sleep. It was the sound that could bring a man from deep sleep to his feet with his weapon in his hand before he was fully conscious. It lived in the body, that readiness, the way certain sounds always live in the body. The sound a parent wakes to when a child cries, the sound that brings you alert in a dark room before your mind has assembled itself. The garrison on the other side of those walls knew this. They knew the camp schedule of watches, or tried to know it, just as the besieging army tried to know the garrison's schedule. Information went back and forth in the way information always finds a way to travel, through the occasional civilian passing under a flag of truce, through deserters, through the camp's various merchants and tradespeople, who sometimes had contact with people in the town below the castle, through the educated guesses of experienced commanders who had been on both sides of enough sieges to know how these things worked. The garrison's goal, if they attempted a night sortie, was to find the gap, the transition between watches, the moment when the outgoing watchman had left his post and the incoming watchman had not yet fully arrived. Those transitions were not wide windows, perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 10, but they were windows, and a well-planned sortie aimed at exactly those windows in exactly those sections of the perimeter where the transition was most predictable. This is why sleeping on watch was not treated as mere dereliction, but as something approaching treason. A watchman who slept was not just failing in his personal duty, he was creating the window. He was opening the gap. Men had been killed because of sleeping watchmen, and those who gave the orders in medieval armies were not men who distinguished between direct and indirect causation when it came to their soldiers' deaths. The punishments were proportional to this severity. A first offence might result in a public beating. The soldier stripped of his equipment and beaten with rods by his own comrades, which was both a punishment and a message. A second offence, or a first offence at a critical post or during a known period of heightened danger, could result in death. Medieval commanders did not have the luxury of lengthy judicial processes, and the sight of a man executed for sleeping on watch was highly effective at keeping the next night's watchmen awake. So they stayed awake. They moved. They talked to their partner in the low voices. They walked the length of their post and back, counted their steps, turned and counted them again. They looked at the stars to track the time, and they breathed the cold air, and they made the small, constant, unglamorous effort of maintaining consciousness through the cold and the dark and the exhaustion of weeks of the same. Let the sound of the camp settle around you. Let it be the background of things, the texture of the air. The commanders slept differently. This is worth understanding because the experience of a knight or a lord or a senior officer in a medieval siege camp was so different from the experience of Robert of Derbyshire that they might almost be in different worlds, which in many important senses they were. The senior men had tents, not the small practical canvas shelters of the common soldiers, but proper pavilions, large, elaborate structures held up by multiple poles, with guy ropes radiating out like the spokes of a wheel, with canvas walls that were sometimes double layered for insulation, with wooden floors or thick rugs laid over their ground, with furniture that had been transported on wagons specifically for this purpose. Inside these pavilions there were folding beds. The medieval folding bed, designed for campaign use, was a masterpiece of practical engineering. A frame of lightweight wood that collapsed flat for transport and opened into a low, stable platform about 18 inches off the ground, strung with rope or leather across its frame to provide a surface that was not, strictly speaking, soft, but was at least elevated above the cold and the damp of the ground. On this frame went a mattress, a canvas bag stuffed with straw or wool or horsehair, depending on the rank and resources of the occupant, and on that mattress went linen sheets and wool blankets, and, for the most senior commanders, a fur coverlet that was worth more than most common soldiers would earn in a year. The smell of a commander's pavilion was different from the smell of the common soldiers' tents. It smelled of wax candles rather than tallow. Beeswax, the expensive kind, which gave a cleaner, sweeter light and less of the animal smell that tallow candles produced. It smelled of the cedar wood of the furniture, of the spices that were sometimes burned on small braziers to combat the perpetual damp smell of a field camp, of the fine wool of the blankets and the linen of the sheets. A senior lord on campaign brought his household with him, not just his knights and men-at-arms, but his personal servants, a squire or two, a body servant, a cook, a chaplain. These people maintained the pavilion, ensured that there was always a fire in the small iron brazier that stood in the centre of the tent, prepared the Lord's food, helped him into and out of his armour, said Mass with him in the morning, and heard his confession when he thought he might die. The Lord slept in something approaching genuine comfort. Not the comfort of a castle or a manor house, not the comfort of stone walls that held heat, of a bedroom that had been arranged over years to be exactly right, of a familiar pillow and a bed that knew the shape of him, but something better than the ground, something better than the cold. And yet even the lords did not sleep deeply. There is an account, not from this particular siege, not from any siege we can pin to a specific time and place, but from the general recorded experience of commanders across this period, of a senior lord lying awake in his pavilion in the 3rd hour of the night, listening, just listening. His blankets pulled up to his chin, his body warm enough, his bed as comfortable as it was going to get, and yet his mind turning over the same questions that kept every responsible man in a siege camp awake. Is the watch alert? Has the garrison been resupplied through the postern gate? Is the siege engine we have been building going to be finished before the weather turns? What are the provisions? The commander of this particular siege is a man of perhaps 50 years, though he looks older. He has been on campaign for most of his adult life, and campaign ages a man in ways that are visible and ways that are not. The visible ways are the obvious ones, the grey in the beard, the deep lines around the eyes, the particular cautious way he moves his left shoulder, where something was damaged in a fight 15 years ago and never healed quite correctly. The invisible ways are harder to describe but equally real. A quality of settled wariness that never quite leaves his eyes, an ability to assess a situation in the time it takes another man to form the question, a patience that is not the patience of a calm temperament, but the patience of someone who has learned, through experience, that impatience costs more than it gains. He is lying on his folding bed in his pavilion, and he is not asleep. He is not trying to be asleep. He has given up on sleep for this hour at least, and is instead doing what he does in these wakeful intervals, thinking through the siege's current state with the systematic attention of a craftsman, going over his tools before a day's work, checking each element, testing each joint, satisfying himself that everything is in order or identifying what is not. The mine progressing, slower than he would like, but progressing. The men report that the earth has changed in quality at the current depth, become wetter and more difficult, but the tunnel is still moving and the direction is correct. Another 10 days perhaps 12, the provisions adequate. The last supply convoy from the south arrived 3 days ago, and what it brought was enough for another 3 weeks, and another convoy is expected before then. The castle's provisions, by his best intelligence, are under greater stress. There have been no reports of resupply through the postern, and the garrison has been in there since August with whatever they had in August, and by October even a well-stocked castle begins to feel the weight of 400 people eating from stores that were not infinite. The weather, the greatest uncertainty. The weather in October in this part of England could be anything. It could continue as it had been, cold and grey and manageable. Or it could turn. A sustained period of rain would reduce the camp's roads to impassable mud, slow the mine's progress, create misery that would wear the men's willingness to hold the siege through another month. He had lived through a winter siege once, 20 years ago, and the memory of it was still available to him in unpleasant detail. He did not want another. He shifted on his bed. The rope support beneath the mattress creaked. Outside, somewhere in the camp, a horse was moving in its lines, a slow rhythmic sound of hooves on cold ground. He thought about the garrison commander. He had met the man years ago in a different context, at a feast that belonged to the world before this siege had made them enemies. He remembered a square-faced, direct man, not particularly warm but not disagreeable, the kind of man who did what he understood to be his duty and expected the same from others. That man was in there now, in the castle, doing the same calculation from the other side, running the same figures in the dark, making the same assessment of the same variables, but with different numbers. Looking out at the camp, at the fires of the camp, the way the camp was looking at the castle's torches. Two men lying awake in the dark, each thinking about the other. He pulled his blanket up a little further and closed his eyes and did not sleep for another hour. The night in the siege camp was not, strictly speaking, silent even in its quietest hours. It had its own soundscape, as specific and consistent as the soundscape of any inhabited place. And that soundscape, once learned, became a kind of assurance in itself, a confirmation that things were as they should be, that nothing had changed, that the 100 small ordinary sounds of a large group of people and animals living in close proximity were still present, and therefore the large, sudden, alarming sound that would indicate they were not was absent. The horses were the most constant element of the night sound. Horses do not sleep in the way that humans sleep. They have a remarkable ability to rest standing up, locking their legs in a way that allows them to doze without lying down, and they cycle in and out of this standing rest throughout the night. But they were not silent. They moved in their lines, the dry sound of their hooves on the cold ground. They breathed, that deep equine breath that is audible from some distance on a still night, a slow bass exhalation. Now and then one of them shifted its weight or tossed its head, and the tack, the bridle, the halter rope, made a small metallic sound, a jingle or a creak. The horses were calming to listen to. They had been here for weeks, and their presence in the night was familiar and unalarmed, and horses that were unalarmed were a reliable indicator that nothing threatening was approaching. A horse that smelled something wrong made a very different kind of sound, a tense and particular restlessness that experienced soldiers learned to read as quickly as any watchman's alarm. As long as the horses sounded like this, slow and steady and bored, the night was progressing normally. There were dogs in the camp. There were always dogs in medieval camps, because dogs were working animals that served practical functions even in a military context. They kept down the rats and mice that would otherwise devastate food stores. They gave warning of approaching strangers, and they provided the particular comfort of animal company that humans have sought from dogs for 10,000 years and will never quite explain rationally. The camp's dogs were mongrels mostly, owned by nobody in particular and everybody in general, fed on scraps and the offcuts of slaughtered animals and whatever else they could find. They ranged the camp at night in small, loose groups, trotting their rounds with the businesslike manner of animals with a purpose, their nails making a light ticking sound on the frozen ground. And the fires. Even the banked low fires of the sleeping camp gave off sound. The very occasional soft pop and creak of cooling wood, the almost imperceptible hiss of a last ember settling, the faint continuous whisper of heated air rising from the embers. If you were lying close enough to a fire's warmth, you heard these sounds the way you hear the sounds of a house at night. The settling, the breathing, the small domestic noises of a thing that is not quite alive but is not quite inanimate either. Into all of this the watchmen moved, their boots on the ground, careful and quiet, the low exchange of words at the perimeter, the sound of the watch captain's rounds, that particular measured footfall of a man who has been doing the same walk for 3 months and whose feet know every irregularity of the path. These sounds were the camp's own heartbeat, its proof of consciousness, the sign that somebody was awake and attending, that the safety of the sleeping thousands rested in the wakefulness of the few. Robert heard all of this, in the tent, the way you hear the sounds of a world you know without quite listening to it. It was the texture of his nights, the specific auditory signature of this place, this situation, this particular chapter of his life. Later, much later, if he lived long enough and grew old enough for memory to become more interesting than anticipation, he would find that these sounds sometimes came back to him unexpectedly. The creak of a tent rope in the wind, the jingle of a horse's tack, the low voice of a watchman on a cold night. And for a moment the tent and the camp and the castle would be present again, more present than the room around him, as vivid and particular as the morning he had first arrived, and seen the whole thing laid out before him, and understood what it was going to mean to spend 3 months in it. But that was later. Tonight he was simply here, in the straw, in the dark, in the warmth of 8 men in a small tent, asleep. The postern gate. It is worth knowing about the postern gate, because it is the reason the camp could never fully relax, the reason the watch was never theoretical, the reason that even the most deeply sleeping soldier had some part of himself listening. Every castle of any size had one. It was a small door set into the wall at an unobtrusive point, often at the side or rear of the castle, away from the main gate, sometimes partially hidden by a tower or a natural feature of the ground. It was not large enough to admit a significant force, but it was large enough to admit a man or a small group of men quickly and quietly in the dark. The postern gate was the garrison's lifeline and the besieger's nightmare. Through the postern gate on dark nights when the camp's attention was elsewhere, the garrison could send out messengers asking for relief, could receive supplies from sympathizers in the surrounding countryside, could send out scouts to assess the camp's positions and weaknesses, could, in the most desperate circumstances, attempt the kind of night raid that the camp's watches were specifically designed to prevent. A postern gate raid was a terrifying thing for a sleeping camp to experience. It began with silence, with the soft opening of a door that had been oiled specifically so that it would not make noise, and then the quiet movement of men who had been planning their route for days, who knew exactly where they were going and what they were going to do when they got there. Their objectives were usually the siege engines, the great wooden machines that were the besiegers' primary weapons, the trebuchets and mangonels and battering rams that represented weeks of labour and enormous cost, and that, if burned, would set the siege back by months. The garrison men carried fire, Small containers of material that burned fast and hot, oil-soaked rags, sulfur compounds, pine resin. They moved low and fast, using every feature of the dark ground between the castle wall and the camp's perimeter, and their goal was to reach the siege engines and set them alight before the alarm could be raised. Sometimes they succeeded. There are accounts of sieges where the garrison pulled off this kind of raid multiple times, burning engines as fast as they were built, extending sieges by weeks and months through this kind of patient, dangerous nocturnal aggression. The besiegers would wake to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting, and the orange glow of their carefully constructed machinery burning, and there would be a frantic, confused scramble in the dark while the garrison men slipped back through the postern gate and barred it behind them. And so the camp maintained its watches not as a formality, but as a genuine and necessary defence. And so the watchmen walked their posts in the cold and tried not to sleep. And so even the men who were not on watch slept with that slight incompleteness of sleep that comes from knowing, even in the deepest part of the night, that the alarm might come. Robert wakes at what his body tells him is shortly before dawn. He does not need to be woken. He has been waking at this hour for months because this is the hour when something in the camp changes. Not noisily, not dramatically, but a subtle shift in the quality of the dark and the cold and the sounds that his sleeping mind has learned to register as the signal that the night is nearly over and the day is beginning. He lies still for a moment. The tent is still warm. Edmund has stopped snoring. He always stops, mysteriously, in the hour before dawn, as if even Edmund's snoring has a schedule. Thomas has his back turned and is deeply, peacefully still. The other men are in their various attitudes of sleep, breathing slowly, present and absent at once. There is one man in the tent who is not asleep. Geoffrey, who joined the company 6 weeks ago to replace a man who went home sick, has been awake for some time. Robert can tell this not from any sound Geoffrey is making, but from the quality of his stillness. It is the deliberate stillness of a man who is trying not to disturb others, the conscious stillness that is entirely different from the unself-conscious stillness of sleep. Robert says nothing. Geoffrey says nothing. They lie in the dark in their private wakefulness, and the tent breathes around them. Geoffrey is sick. Not badly, not frighteningly, but enough that his stomach has been troubling him for the past 4 days, the low, persistent trouble of a digestion that has been dealing with camp food and camp water for 6 weeks and is registering its objections. It is not an unusual complaint. Half the company has had some version of it at some point in the siege. It is the ordinary tax that a large temporary settlement levies on the bodies of the people living in it. The accumulated consequence of latrines that are never quite far enough from the water source, of food prepared in conditions that no peacetime cook would tolerate, of bodies under sustained stress whose ordinary defences against minor illness are somewhat compromised. The camp surgeon, a man called Master Henry, whose qualification was a combination of apprenticeship, experience, and the general principle that in the absence of anyone better you became the best available, held his consultations in a tent at the rear of the camp's main area, away from the worst of the mud. He was a pragmatic man who had been with armies long enough to have no illusions about what he could and could not treat, and he had divided his patients into three informal categories: those who would recover without his intervention, and merely needed to be told so with sufficient authority to be reassured; those who had injuries or conditions that he could meaningfully address with the tools and knowledge available to him; and those who were beyond what he could do. The first category was the largest. Most of the men who came to his tent were tired and miserable, and needed someone with the status to tell them that what they had was not going to kill them, and that they should eat plain food and drink boiled water and rest if they could get it, and come back if it got worse. Master Henry delivered this counsel with the brisk authority of a man who has said the same thing several thousand times, and believes it every single time he says it, because it happens to be true. The second category required the work he had actually trained for: wounds, of which there were a steady supply from the minor skirmishes and from the various accidents of camp life: falling from a cart, being kicked by a horse, the 100 ways that a camp full of tired people and heavy equipment and sharp metal generated minor and not so minor injuries. He cleaned wounds with wine, which was not precisely a scientific choice, but happened to reduce infection rates in ways that would not be understood for another 5 centuries. He set broken bones, which required speed and strength, and the capacity to ignore a patient screaming while doing something that caused the screaming and was nonetheless necessary. He stitched cuts with thread and a needle and applied poultices of things: yarrow, willow bark, garlic, that worked to varying degrees, and that he had learned to use from men who had learned from men who had learned from men, in a chain of practical knowledge that stretched back further than anyone bothered to trace. The third category he noted, and where he could, made comfortable, and beyond that he was honest about his limits. The sick and injured lay in their own section of the camp, in tents that were deliberately placed to the south and west, downwind of the main camp, because no one fully understood germ theory, but everyone understood the practical way of long experience that illness spread from person to person, and that distance was the primary counter to spreading. The worst cases were kept separate. Men who had the camp fever, the dysentery and typhus that were the great killers of medieval sieges, far more destructive than enemy action, were isolated as much as the camp's size and organisation allowed, which was not very much, and they died at a rate that the commanders tracked with worried attention, because dead men were not replaced immediately, and the camp's effective strength eroded with every week. Robert had not been seriously ill. He had had the stomach trouble that Geoffrey now had. He had had a week of the kind of heavy cold that leaves you functional but miserable, and he had had a deep cut on his right forearm from the skirmish at the eastern gate that Master Henry had cleaned and stitched, and which had healed without going septic, which was not inevitable, and for which Robert felt a private, genuine gratitude. He was, by the standards of a 14th century siege, a healthy man, but he was tired in a way that was not the tiredness of a single night's poor sleep. He was tired in the way that weeks and months of sustained physical work and broken sleep and constant low-level stress creates tiredness, a tiredness that lived in the bones, that accumulated like sediment, that a single night's good rest could not touch. He would carry this tiredness home with him when the siege ended, and it would take weeks to lift, and the lifting of it would feel like a gradual brightening, like a lamp being turned slowly up. He was not thinking about any of this as he lay in the tent in the pre-dawn dark. He was simply awake and warm and almost comfortable, and the morning had not yet arrived to demand anything of him. He stared at the canvas above him. In the faint, very first pre-dawn light that was beginning, just barely, to filter through the waxed cloth, he could see the texture of it, the weave of the canvas, the pattern of the waterproofing, the small irregular imperfections of something that had been made quickly and practically, and without any attention to beauty. He thinks about home in the abstract way he tends to think about it at this hour. Not with longing exactly. He has passed the acute homesickness of the first weeks of campaign, which has mellowed into something more like a background awareness of home's existence. He thinks about the village in Derbyshire, the particular quality of the light there in the early morning, the sound of the mill wheel on the stream. He thinks about his mother, who is probably doing what she always does in the early morning, which is the same thing she was doing when he left. These are not sad thoughts. They are not joyful thoughts. They are the thoughts of a man who has been away long enough that home has become a concept as much as a place, a warmth in the eyne that is real without being urgent. He hears, from outside the tent, the first sound of the camp stirring, a cook's fire being started, the crack and spark of it, a horse blowing through its lips, that deep, resonant sound that horses make when they are greeting the morning. A voice, somewhere, calling something that he cannot quite make out. The day is beginning. He closes his eyes and tries for another 20 minutes of sleep, which is what he always does at this point in the morning, and which sometimes works and sometimes does not. This morning it does not. He lies still anyway, with his eyes closed, and that is something. That is not nothing. The day is beginning. He closes his eyes and tries for another 20 minutes of sleep, which is what he always does at this point in the morning, and which sometimes works and sometimes does not. This morning it does not. He lies still anyway, with his eyes closed, and that is something. That is not nothing. The thing about lying still with your eyes closed when sleep will not come is that it is not nothing, despite how it feels. The body continues to rest. The heartbeat remains slow. The breathing remains easy. The muscles stay relaxed in their horizontal position, rather than having to work against gravity. The body is getting something from the horizontal stillness even when the mind is conscious of it. And Robert, who did not have the language for this but had the practical knowledge of it, had long since made his peace with the difference between sleeping and resting. On the nights when sleep came quickly and completely, he was grateful. On the nights when it did not, he lay still and let the body take what it could. And that was enough, because it had to be. The camp sounds were changing around him. The quality of quiet that belongs specifically to the deepest night was gone now, replaced by the slightly busier quiet of early morning. The sounds of the day preparing to begin, the cook's fires crackling into life, the horses starting their more active morning restlessness, the first distant voices of men who rose early. Not loud yet, not the full percussion of a camp in daylight, just the first tentative sounds of a world reclaiming itself from sleep. He heard, outside the tent, the voice of the company's cook, a Yorkshireman called Simon, who began his work in what he called the proper dark. meaning the hour before even the pre-dawn greyness had arrived, and who had strong opinions about oats and about the people who did not appreciate them, and who communicated both of these things at length to anyone within earshot. Simon was talking now to his assistant, a boy of 14 whose name Robert had never quite caught, and the subject, from the fragments Robert could make out through the tent canvas, appeared to be the state of the firewood, which Simon found inadequate in both quantity and quality, and which he expressed this view about with the fluency of a man who had been expressing the same view about the same firewood every morning for 11 weeks. Robert allowed himself a small private smile at this. The consistency of Simon's complaint about the firewood was, in its way, one of the most comforting features of the siege camp. It was the same every morning. It would be the same tomorrow morning. In a situation characterized by uncertainty and discomfort, and the low, constant anxiety of proximity to danger, the reliable irritability of the camp cook was something close to reassurance. There were days in the siege when it rained. This is worth dwelling on, because rain changed the camp utterly and completely, in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced a prolonged rain in an outdoor camp with medieval materials. It was not the polite, apologetic rain of a modern camping trip, endurable because the tent is waterproof, and there is a car nearby, and the whole thing will end by tomorrow. It was the categorical, committed, days-long rain of a 14th century English October, which fell with the unhurried thoroughness of something that had no particular reason to stop, and plenty of cloud to sustain itself with. The canvas of the tents could manage a certain amount of rain. The waxing that waterproofed them was reapplied at intervals by men whose job it was to keep the camp's equipment in order, and fresh waxing was reasonably effective. But canvas that had been in the field for 3 months, canvas that had been stretched and compressed and rained on, and dried and rained on again, canvas that had small holes in it from stakes and ropes and careless handling, canvas that had its waxing unevenly applied or worn thin in the places where it was most stretched. This canvas leaked, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific targeted way of a leak that has found the lowest point of a surface and delivers itself there with quiet persistence. A thin thread of water running down the inside of a tent wall. A drip from a seam that had not been fully sealed. A spreading damp patch in the straw underfoot where the water had come through and pooled in the slight depression that 8 men's bodies had worn into the ground over weeks. The smell of a wet camp was something that, once encountered, stayed with a person. It was the smell of wet wool, which is a particular and insistent smell, warm and animal and slightly medicinal. The smell of lanolin releasing itself from saturated fibres. It was the smell of wet canvas, which was more neutral but had a slight sourness to it. It was the smell of churned wet mud. The mud that the camp's roads and common areas became when rain fell on ground that had already been thoroughly worked over by thousands of feet and dozens of wheels. Mud that had the consistency and the smell of something deeply organic, rich and dark and faintly sweet in the way that decomposing vegetable matter is faintly sweet. In the rain, the camp's ordinary activities became significantly harder. Cutting wood was harder because wet wood was heavier, and the working ground around the wood pile was treacherous. Moving heavy equipment was harder because wheels sank into the softened ground and had to be levered out. Keeping fires going was harder because the wind that came with the rain scattered the heat, and wet wood steamed before it burned, and the camp's cooks became even more vocal in their discontent. And sleeping was harder because the drip in the corner of the tent and the damp rising from the ground under the straw, and the sound of rain on the canvas, a sound that is simultaneously one of the most soothing sounds in the world from inside a dry, warm shelter, and one of the most demoralizing sounds in the world from inside a tent that is neither quite dry nor quite warm, combined into a combination that eroded the body's ability to rest. Robert had developed, over the course of the siege's several significant rainfalls, a specific arrangement for sleeping in the wet. He pulled his cloak over his head as well as his body, creating a kind of cocoon that kept the worst of the drip from landing directly on his face. He tucked the edges of the cloak under him to keep the rising damp from the straw away from the sides of his body. And he put his boots, which he kept on, which almost everyone kept on in a siege camp, because the time it took to put them back on in an emergency was time that could not always be spared, as close to his body as possible to keep them from becoming too cold overnight. This arrangement worked tolerably. Not well. Tolerably. It was the word that described most of the siege's conditions. Tolerable. Not comfortable. Not pleasant. Not what a person would choose. But manageable. And human beings are remarkably good at managing conditions that are merely tolerable when the alternative is not managing them, because the alternative is worse. On the bad rain nights, Robert lay in his damp cloak and listened to the drumming of the canvas and thought, with concentrated specificity, about the feeling of being dry. Not about warmth. Warmth was a larger, more complex thing, just dry. The specific, simple feeling of fabric that was not saturated, of skin that was not perpetually slightly damp, of the air in a room that was not heavy with the moisture of wet wool and wet ground. He did not romanticize it. He just held the memory of it in his mind the way you might hold something small and solid in your hand, carefully, specifically, knowing exactly what it was. And eventually, even on the bad nights, sleep came. The mornings in a siege camp have a rhythm as fixed as any monastery's timetable, though arrived at through very different means. The fires come first. The camp's cooks and every company had at least one man whose primary job was feeding the rest, even if his title was never more formal than that, had usually been up since before dawn, rebuilding the fires that had been banked through the night and beginning the slow process of preparing the morning meal. In a well-supplied camp, this meant porridge, which was the staple morning food of the medieval common soldier in exactly the same way it was the staple morning food of the medieval common civilian, because oats and barley were cheap and filling and could be kept without spoiling and required nothing more than water and heat to become a meal. The oats were soaked overnight in whatever pot or vessel was available, and in the morning they were set on the fire to cook, stirring occasionally, thickening into a grey, heavy mass that was not delicious, and was not supposed to be delicious, but was warm and filling, and gave a man something solid to face the morning with. Better days brought bread, the field ovens, simple clay and stone structures that could be built anywhere and fired with whatever wood was available, produced loaves that were dense and slightly gritty with ash, and not particularly reminiscent of the bread a man might bake in a proper household with proper flour and proper time, but bread nonetheless, with a crust that crackled and an interior that was warm when you broke it open, and that warmth was enough. Better days still brought something to go with the bread: cheese, which kept well on campaign, salted pork or mutton, which kept well enough and provided fat and protein, and the particular savagery of salt that a body working hard in the cold specifically craved. Dried beans and peas, cooked to a mush that was not appetizing in any aesthetic sense, but was dense with calories that a soldier's body needed, and knew it needed. The food was eaten without ceremony. Men sat wherever they could find a place, on the ground, on upturned logs, on the wooden boxes that served as the camp's furniture, and ate with the focused, economical attention of people who are hungry and have learned not to take food for granted. The tin or wooden bowl, the spoon. The common soldier's spoon was typically made of wood, and was one of the few personal items he was expected to provide for himself. The leather cup for the weak ale or watered wine that accompanied every meal, because the water supply was not entirely trustworthy and everyone knew it. After eating, the day's work began, because a siege for the common soldier was mostly work. The vast timber infrastructure of a large siege operation required constant maintenance. The siege engines needed their ropes checked and replaced, their throwing arms inspected for cracks, their counterweights adjusted. The palisade around the camp needed reinforcement wherever the ground had softened and the stakes had shifted. The camp's roads, such as they were, needed to be filled with rubble where the mud had become impassable. Wood needed to be cut both for fuel and for construction. The trench and earthwork systems that had been dug in the early weeks of the siege needed pumping out when the rains came, which in October in England was often. And the building continued. The building always continued. Whether it was the great siege tower that a team of carpenters had been assembling for the past 3 weeks, or the mine shaft that a group of specialists were digging toward the base of the castle's eastern wall, or the additional earthworks that the commander had ordered to block the road to the north, there was always something being built, and building required men, and men required direction and supervision, and the constant application of effort to material that resisted. Robert spent his mornings that autumn in a work party assigned to the mine. The mine was not a mine in the modern sense. It was a tunnel begun at a point safely out of bowshot from the castle walls and angled downward into the earth, its goal the foundations of the wall's corner tower. The principle was simple. Undermine the foundations, prop them with timber as you went, fill the void with combustible material, set it alight, and when the timber burned through and the props collapsed, the tower above would come down, opening a breach in the wall through which the army could attack. The execution was a great deal more complicated than the principle. The tunnel was perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, which meant that the men working in it were bent double at all times, and could not turn around but had to crawl backward to exit, which they did by hauling themselves out on a rope. The air in the tunnel was bad, thick with the smell of damp earth, and the exhalations of the men in it and the oil of the lamps they carried, small clay lamps burning rendered fat that gave a faint orange light and a considerable amount of smoke. The ground was wet. The tunnel walls were shored with timber as they went, but the timber was green wood cut from the forest to the south, and it swelled with the damp and sometimes shifted in the night, requiring the whole section to be reinforced again the next morning. The men who work the mine were not the same men every day. The work was rotated partly because of the physical and psychological demands of spending 2 hours bent double in a narrow underground space with poor air, and partly because concentrated underground work had effects on the body, the lungs especially, that even the camp's Master Henry recognized as something to be managed by limiting exposure. But there was a group of specialists who worked the mine more than others, the men who had come with the army specifically for this purpose, men who understood earth and stone and the particular physics of undermining in a way that common soldiers did not. These were miners in the original sense, men from the mining districts of the country who had spent years underground and whose bodies had adapted to that environment in ways that were visible and ways that were not. They were, almost uniformly, smaller than the average soldier, which was an advantage underground. They moved in the tunnel with a facility that other men could not replicate, an ease in confined dark spaces that came from a lifetime of exactly this. They were also, for the most part, quiet men, not sullen or unfriendly, but economical with speech in the way that people become economical with speech when their working hours are spent in places where speech uses air that is not easily replaced. Their contribution to the siege was invisible in a way that bothered them not at all. The chroniclers who wrote about the siege would mention the things in passing, if they mentioned it at all. They would not name the miners, would not describe the specific quality of courage it required to go into the ground every morning and do a day's work toward a specific structural failure that, if it happened while you were in the tunnel, would bury you. The miners knew this, and they did not require the mention. They required the wage and the end of the work and the road home, and these things the siege provided in due course. Robert was not a miner. He was a supplementary labourer, one of the men who dragged the excavated earth away from the tunnel entrance in wooden boxes on rope sledges, who carried water to the men inside, who maintained the timber props that were being supplied to the tunnel in steadily growing quantities. His relationship with the mine was entirely external. He respected it, and he was not unhappy, on balance, to be the man on the outside of it rather than the inside. The tunnel was progressing, he understood, at a rate that the specialist miners considered acceptable. Another 10 days, perhaps 12. And then the timber props would be set with the combustible material, and the word would go to the commander, and the tunnel entrance would be sealed from the outside, and sometime in the following night, or the night after, it would be lit. He tried not to think too specifically about what it would feel like to be in the castle or in the tower above the mine when it went. The mine's entrance was narrow and unprepossessing, a dark hole in the earth, shored with timber at its lip, with a constant slow seepage of water running out of it onto the ground where it had created a small cold pool. In the mornings when Robert came to work, there was always a moment, standing at the entrance waiting for instructions, when he looked into the dark of the tunnel and felt the particular feeling that dark enclosed spaces produce in people who are not born to them. Not quite fear, more a heightened awareness, a noticing of how small the opening was, and how thick the earth above it, and how the light stopped very quickly and completely just a few feet in. He turned away from the tunnel entrance and went to find the rope sledge and got to work. Let the afternoon light come in, that thin, pale October light that does not warm much but illuminates everything with a kind of clean, flat clarity. Let it fall across the camp, across the tents and the fires and the siege engines and the muddy ground, and let everything be simply what it is, without drama, without importance, just the ordinary, slow continuation of a day in a long, slow, ordinary siege. There was time in a siege camp, in the afternoons especially, that had to be filled. Time that was not officially allocated to work or watch. Time that fell between the demands of the day's labour and the beginning of the evening meal. This was both a gift and a problem. A gift because tired men needed rest, and the rest was necessary. A problem because idle men in a confined area with nothing to do found ways to fill their time that were not always in the camp's best interests. Gambling was everywhere. Dice games primarily. Dice were small and portable, and required no equipment beyond the dice themselves, and the games were fast and the stakes were real, and the whole thing provided the particular combination of social interaction and minor suspense that makes time pass. Medieval armies tried to regulate gambling, sometimes successfully and mostly not, because the consequences of unchecked gambling were predictable and consistent. Men lost their pay before they had received it. Debts accumulated that could not be paid. Debts that could not be paid led to disputes. Disputes led to fights, and fights in a camp full of armed, sleep-deprived men could turn serious very quickly. There was drinking. The camp's sutlers, the civilian traders who followed every medieval army and provided what the army's official supply chain did not, sold ale and wine from their carts and tents, and the business was brisk, particularly in the evenings. The ale was not strong by modern standards, but it was not water either, and an evening's steady drinking was an evening's warm oblivion, which was exactly what a great many tired soldiers were looking for. The mornings after were part of the camp's texture too. The men with heads that hurt and eyes that had trouble with the light, going about their morning duties with the particular care of people managing a temporary but real internal crisis. There were minstrels and entertainers sometimes, travelling musicians who moved from camp to camp along the roads of war, playing songs that everyone knew, and some songs that no one had heard before, singing narratives of battles and heroes and loves that were all the more powerful for being delivered to an audience that was living, in its own quieter way, a version of the same story. These performances gathered crowds quickly. Men sitting in the mud or on whatever perch they could find, listening with the focused, slightly desperate attention of people who have been starved for entertainment for weeks. There was prayer. The chaplains attached to noble households held mass daily, and the common soldiers attended or did not according to their inclination, but the inclination ran high in a siege camp in a way it sometimes did not elsewhere. There was something about the particular combination of proximity to death, prolonged discomfort, and uncontrollable waiting that made the rituals of faith more compelling, more necessary, more real. Men who would not have been seen inside a church at home knelt in the mud of a siege camp and said prayers that they meant completely, asking for the same things that people have always asked for in dangerous places: safety, warmth, enough to eat, and the ability to go home. Robert was not a deeply religious man, in the sense of having a theology or a framework for thinking about what he believed. But he said his prayers every morning and every night, because his mother had told him to, and because the habit had outlasted the instruction and become simply something he did, like breathing. The prayers were short and mostly the same ones every time, and he said them quietly without much ceremony, and when they were done he felt marginally better. The way a routine that has been kept always makes you feel marginally better. In the late afternoon, if the weather was not too bad and the afternoon work was finished, there was sometimes time to simply sit. To sit near a fire and look at nothing in particular and let the mind do whatever minds do when they are not required to attend to anything specific. Medieval people did not have a concept of leisure exactly as we have it. The sharp distinction between work time and free time, the idea that certain hours belong specifically to rest and recreation, but they had bodies and minds that needed recovery, and they found ways to provide for that need that were not formally designated as anything at all. Robert spent these afternoon sitting times usually near the fire with Will Carpenter, who was the man in his company he was closest to, in the way that proximity and shared experience creates closeness without much deliberate effort. Will was a quiet man who did not feel the need to fill silence, which Robert appreciated, and the two of them would sit together for an hour sometimes, saying almost nothing, watching the fire, watching the camp, watching the castle in the middle distance with the neutral, habituated observation of men who had been watching it for 11 weeks and had run out of things to think about it. Will had a habit in these times of whittling. He always had a piece of wood in his hands and a small knife, and whatever it was he was making, a spoon, a toy figure, a handle for something, emerged slowly from the wood over the course of many days, shaved in small increments during these sitting times, the curls of pale wood falling to the ground around his feet. It was not fine work. Will was not a craftsman in his father's sense, despite the name, but it kept his hands busy, and it gave the sitting times a quality of productivity that made them feel less like simply doing nothing. The light faded. It faded early in October, the way October light does, not gradually, not giving you time to adjust, but quickly, as if the day simply decided at a certain point that it was done and closed itself up. The afternoon became early evening, became dusk, all within the span of an hour, and with the dark came the cold again, and the fires were built up and the evening meal was prepared, and the camp contracted around its lights the way a living thing contracts around its warmth when the temperature drops. The evening had its own particular mood in the siege camp. It was different from the morning, different from the afternoon. The morning was purposeful, there was work to do, and everyone knew what it was. The afternoon was liminal, half purposeful, the time of whittling and gambling and prayer. But the evening, the hour between supper and the first sleep, had a quality that was almost social. Men gathered near fires in small groups, the natural groupings of the camp, tent mates, workmates, men from the same village or region who had found each other in the first days of the campaign and stayed loosely affiliated since. The fire at the centre of Robert's company's area was the best fire in that part of the camp, in Robert's unbiased assessment, because it was Simon the cook's fire, and Simon maintained it with the same proprietary intensity he brought to every aspect of his domain. During the evening it burned well, proper wood, stacked properly, with a good bed of coals underneath that would see it through the banking at night. The smoke went mostly upward rather than sideways, which was a matter of how the fire was laid and the slight shelter the tent line provided from the prevailing wind, and the heat came outward in an even way that the men sitting around it appreciated. They sat in no particular order these evenings, not by rank or by tent assignment or by any principle other than who had arrived first and found a spot. Will Carpenter was almost always there early, his piece of wood in his hands, his knife working its slow, patient work. Edmund, who had a reputation for telling stories that were entertaining in direct proportion to their departure from literal truth, usually held the position nearest the fire on its downwind side, where the smoke went away from him. The boy Thomas sat slightly back, as young men do in the company of older men, close enough to be part of the group and far enough to maintain the slight distance that was simultaneously humility and self-protection. There was a man called John Mariner, who was not a mariner in any sense. He had never been to sea and did not want to, the name being his grandfather's somehow, who played a small instrument that Robert had never heard called by a consistent name, but which was a kind of simple pipe, a small wooden tube with finger holes, and whose music was not virtuosic, but was real and warm, and had the quality that live music always has of making a space feel more inhabited, more itself, more alive than it was before the music started. John Mariner played in the evenings, quietly, working through a small repertoire of tunes that the camp had come to know over 11 weeks, that had become as much a part of the siege's texture as the castle and the mud and Simon's opinions about firewood. The tunes were simple. They were the tunes that everyone knew, the ones that had been played at festivals and in ale-houses and at weddings and at the end of harvest in every village in England, the ones that had been around so long that no one remembered who had made them or when, the ones that were simply in the air, in the culture, as much a part of the landscape as the hills. When John Mariner played them in the firelight of the siege camp, 3 months away from home and surrounded by men who were all missing something, some specific warmth, some specific face, some room in some building in some village, the tunes did what familiar music always does. They made the missing thing present for a moment, not painfully but warmly, like a memory that arrives of its own accord and is welcome. Robert listened to the music and felt in that quiet evening way connected, not to any particular person or place, but to the fact of people sitting around fires in the dark and making music and listening to it, which had been happening for longer than anyone could conceive of, and would go on happening after everyone sitting around this particular fire was long gone. The fire was different each time, and the people were different each time, and the music changed over the centuries, but the thing itself, the circle of warmth in the dark, the sound of human-made music, the faces of people relaxed and together and briefly at rest from whatever was pressing them, that thing was the same. It was as old as the species. John Mariner played through his repertoire, and then played the beginning of one of the tunes again, and Edmund, unprompted, began to sing. Edmund's voice was not a good voice in any trained sense. It was rough and slightly flat in the higher notes, and it didn't so much carry a melody as chase it enthusiastically without always catching it. But it was a real voice, an unself-conscious voice, the voice of a man who sang because singing was part of what you did at an evening fire, and not because he had any pretension about the quality of what came out. One or two others joined in on the chorus, the part everyone knew, and the singing was ragged and warm and entirely unperformable by any standard that mattered in formal contexts, and perfect by every standard that mattered here. Robert did not sing. He was not a man who sang easily in company, but he sat by the fire and listened, and let the music and the voices be the texture of the evening, and he felt in the specific way that evenings by fires produce feeling, that this was all right, that the siege and the cold and the mud and the weeks away from home and the castle on its hill that was not yet finished falling, all of it was all right, not good necessarily, not what he would have chosen, but all right, manageable, part of a story that would have an end, and whose end would include a road south and a fire at home and a face he was missing. The fire burned, the music played, the evening continued, and then the evening was over, and the fires were banked, and the camp began its long descent into sleep. Robert stayed at the fire later than most. He was not a man who found sleep easy at the beginning of the night. He found it easy enough in the second and third watches, in the hours after midnight, but the first hours of the night were often restless for him, his mind too active, the day's residue still moving through him. So he sat and watched the fire and let the camp quiet itself around him, and when the fire was low and the cold had become pressing enough to outweigh the fire's warmth, he went to the tent. But before he went, in that last interval when the fire had collapsed to a deep bed of orange coals, and the camp around him had largely settled to quiet, he looked at the castle. He did this most nights, this last looking. He could not have explained why, except that it was there, and it had been there every night for 11 weeks, and there was something in the consistency of its presence that had become its own kind of relationship, its own kind of familiarity. He knew this castle now in the way that you know the face of someone you see every day without ever speaking to them, not knowing them exactly, but knowing the specific arrangement of their features, the way the light falls on them at different times of day, the ways they look the same each time and the ways they are always slightly different. The castle at night, seen from the camp, was a complicated thing to look at. It was dark, mostly. The walls absorbed what little light there was and gave nothing back. Against the sky it was a silhouette, the crenellations of the battlements, the squared shapes of the towers, the long horizontal run of the curtain wall. In daylight, the castle was pale stone, slightly warm in colour when the sun was right, the kind of stone that the Midland counties of England built everything from in this period, pulled out of quarries that had been in use for centuries and would be in use for centuries more. At night it was simply dark, a solid darkness that was different from the darkness of the sky behind it, a darkness with edges, but not entirely dark, not entirely. The torch on the battlements had been burning every night for 11 weeks. It was replaced presumably at intervals. Torches do not last all night, but there was always a torch there, in the same approximate position, at that particular corner of the northern tower where the garrison had established their main watch point. It burned with the small, unsteady orange light of an open flame in a slight wind, flickering in the way of all open flames, alternating between a bright moment and a dimmer one in the random, irregular rhythm that firelight has always had. Robert had watched that torch for 11 weeks. He had watched it from his watchpost, and he had watched it from the mine entrance, and he had watched it from the evening fires, and he had watched it sometimes from the opening of his tent in the middle of the night when he woke and lay there and could not return immediately to sleep. The torch had become, in its way, a presence in his life as specific and consistent as any person he encountered daily. He thought about the man who kept the torch lit, not with any particular feeling of enmity or sympathy. Both of those required a more personal knowledge than he had, just with the simple awareness that there was a man up there, or a rotation of men, and they were cold too, and they were watching the camp the way the camp was watching them, and the torch was their answer to the camp's fires. A small human light against the dark, a signal that said we are still here, we are still watching, we have not given up. He understood that impulse. He had stood his own watches and made his own presence known to the dark and the castle, with the small human signal of the watchman's movement, the lantern, the voice calling clear to the watch captain. It was the same impulse, the need to assert presence in the dark, to say I am here, I am awake, I am a person and not merely a darkness in the darkness. He looked at the torch for a while. It flickered, it burned. He turned away from it and went to the tent. He unlaced the flap. He ducked inside. He took off his helmet and loosened his surcoat and laid down in the straw, with his cloak pulled over him, and Edmund was already snoring and Thomas was already somewhere in his nightly migrations across the sleeping surface, and the tent smelled of wool and breath, and the long, slow accumulation of 8 men's days, and the ground was hard beneath him. He looked at the canvas above him for a while. He listened to the camp outside, the horses, the watchmen, the very distant sounds from behind the castle's walls, the ordinary quiet noise of a night that was, so far, not alarming. He thought about the mine, about the section they had reinforced today, about whether the shoring was solid enough, about the specific quality of the earth they were moving through at this depth which was different from the earth above it, wetter, colder, darker, a soil that had never been touched by light. He thought about the torch on the battlements, faintly present through the canvas of the tent, not visible exactly, but knowable, still there. He thought about home, about the sound of the mill, about the smell of the kitchen in winter when the fire had been going all day, and the stone walls had absorbed the heat and were giving it back slowly. That particular warmth of a familiar room at the end of a cold day that is unlike any other warmth in the world, because it is the warmth of a specific place that belongs to you. He thought about the sound of rain on the thatch, heavier, slower, more final than the sound of rain on canvas, the sound of a structure that was built to last and not merely to endure. He thought about the chair by the fire and the weight of his own body in it after a long day. He thought about these things not with anguish, but with the steady, patient awareness of someone who knows the thing they are missing still exists and will be there when they return. This was the particular mercy of being away from home rather than having lost it. The knowledge that the absence was temporary, that the road between here and there existed and could be walked. He had this knowledge the way he had his cloak, something reliable, something worn smooth with use, something that would be there in the morning. And then, without deciding to, he was asleep. Let the night deepen around you. Let the images of the camp become very soft, very distant, very still. The siege of this particular castle. We have not named it because its name is not the point, because it is every castle and no castle, a composite of all the long, cold, patient, grinding sieges that punctuated the 14th century, the way the weather punctuated the 14th century, frequently, inevitably, with periods of intense misery and long stretches of grey endurance. The siege continued for another 3 weeks after the night we have been visiting. The siege of this particular castle. We have not named it because its name is not the point, because it is every castle and no castle, a composite of all the long, cold, patient, grinding sieges that punctuated the 14th century the way the weather punctuated the 14th century, frequently, inevitably, with periods of intense misery and long stretches of grey endurance. The siege continued for another 3 weeks after the night we have been visiting. Those 3 weeks were not dramatically different from the weeks that had come before them. The mine progressed. The rain came and went. The watches were kept. The fires were banked each night and rebuilt each morning. Simon complained about the firewood. John Mariner played his tunes at the evening fires. Edmund snored. Thomas moved in his sleep. What changed was small and gradual, and then suddenly decisive. The mine reached the foundations. The miners confirmed it with a knock on the stone above them, a particular resonant sound different from the sound of earth, and the news moved through the camp in the way that significant news moves through any contained community. Quietly at first, passed from man to man in low voices, and then louder, and then generally known, and with the knowing of it a change in the camp's mood that was not quite excitement. Not yet. Not until the thing was actually done. But a loosening of something that had been tight for weeks. A sense that the end of this chapter might actually be near. The preparations took 3 days. The timber props of the mine's final section were packed with pig fat and kindling and the combustible mixture that the miners carried for their purpose, a dark compound that smelled of pitch and sulphur and something else that Robert could not identify and chose not to investigate. The mine entrance was sealed from the outside with turf and stone. A long cord of twisted hemp soaked in oil was run from the packed material back along the tunnel and out through a narrow gap left for exactly this purpose. The lighting was done at night because everything important in a siege was done at night. Robert was on watch when it happened. He was standing at his post, which on this night had been moved slightly to give him a better angle on the section of the castle's wall above the mine's endpoint, and he watched the 2 men go to the tunnel entrance with their torch and bend over the cord and do something brief and deliberate and then move quickly away. There was a wait. The wait felt very long. The camp behind him was quiet, not fully asleep, not on this night, because word had gone through the companies that something was happening, and there were men awake who would not normally be awake, standing at the edges of the tented lines and looking toward the castle in the dark. A waiting quiet, a held breath quiet. And then the ground moved. Not violently, not the way it moves in tales, not with a roar and a shock wave. It moved the way the ground moves when something large and deep shifts, a low vibration that came up through the soles of Robert's boots, through his legs, into his body, a feeling more than a sound. And then a sound followed, a deep, grinding, massive sound, the sound of stone moving that had not moved for 100 years, and the corner of the tower, just the corner, just the base of it, shifted. A crack appeared in the wall, visible even at this distance, even in the dark, because the pale stone showed where it had separated and the darkness showed in the gap. The camp exhaled. The crack widened over the following days as the ground below settled further and the tower's weight redistributed itself in ways the original builders had not anticipated, and the structure did what unsupported structures do when gravity finds the weak point. By the 4th day after the mine was lit, the lean was visible from across the camp. By the 7th day, negotiations had begun. Castles fell most of the time, not by storm, but by negotiation, by the slow calculation of when the cost of holding out had come to outweigh the terms that could be obtained by surrendering. The garrison commander sent a messenger under a white flag to discuss terms. The terms were negotiated over several days, back and forth, with the precise and careful attention to honour and precedent that governed these transactions, because how a garrison was treated when it surrendered affected how other garrisons in other castles would behave when faced with the same calculation. Treat them well, and other garrisons surrender sooner. Treat them badly, and other garrisons hold out longer, knowing what they face. The terms were agreed. The gate opened. The garrison marched out, the commander at their head with his sword held horizontally before him, in the gesture of formal surrender, his men following in column, and the besieging army stood aside and let them pass in silence, because silence was the proper acknowledgment of a garrison that had held as long as it honourably could. And the siege camp was dismantled. The tents were struck. The equipment was loaded onto wagons. The siege engines were either broken down for transport or left to be dealt with by the castle's new occupants, and the army formed up on the road and began to march. Robert marched with them. He carried his cloak over his arm because the day was warmer than the nights had been, and he walked in the middle of the column, and the road south stretched out ahead of him in the pale autumn sunlight, and the castle behind him shrank as the miles accumulated between them until it was just a pale shape on a hill in the middle distance, and then it was out of sight entirely, swallowed by the landscape the way everything is eventually swallowed by the landscape. He did not look back. He had been in the camp long enough that there was nothing behind him that he needed to see again. The road was ahead. The road was what mattered, and where the road went, eventually, was the direction of... Now let the story settle into the space around you like warmth. Think for a moment in the quiet place where thought is slow and easy, about what connects you to Robert. Not the century, not the language, not the circumstances of life that are utterly different in almost every way, but the thing underneath all of that, the thing that does not change. He was tired, and he wanted to sleep. He was cold, and he moved toward warmth. He had been away from home for a long time, and home was still present in his mind, not as a plan or a destination, but as a warmth, a quality of memory. He lay down in the dark and listened to the sound around him, and thought about whatever he thought about in those last minutes before sleep. And then he let go of consciousness and went somewhere that none of us can follow each other, the private country of sleep. You are about to do the same thing. You have been doing the same thing your entire life, lying down in the dark and letting the sounds of the world become background, and letting the thoughts of the day become less insistent, and finally, giving yourself over to rest. You have done it 1,000 times, 10,000 times. It is the most practiced thing you do. Your body knows how to do it the way it knows how to breathe. The knowledge is in you, deep and old and entirely reliable. Robert knew it too, and before Robert, every person who ever lay down to sleep in a medieval camp or a stone house, or a round house, or a cave, every person who has ever been tired at the end of a long and effortful day, every person who has ever felt the particular gift of horizontal warmth after a long time upright and cold, all of them did this thing you're doing right now. All of them let the world get quieter and quieter and quieter still. All of them felt their breathing slow. All of them felt the weight of their body become more itself, more settled, more given over to the surface beneath them. All of them crossed, without quite knowing when they crossed it, the threshold that has no ceremony, the border that has no landmark, the soft dissolving edge between being awake and being asleep. Let your breathing slow now, just a little, just naturally. Let the weight of your body press down gently into whatever is beneath you. Let the sounds around you become background, just texture, just the world continuing to be itself without requiring your participation. The fire is low, the stars are out, the camp is quiet, the castle is a dark shape against the night sky, patient and still. Somewhere on the battlement a single torch is burning, and its light is the last light, and even it is very far away, very small, very gentle. Everything is quiet, everything is still. Sleep well,